The late 40s is one of my favorite eras of fashion of all time. We're seeing the beginning of the Dior new look, but it still retained a lot of the aspects of the boxy 1940s silhouette. We see skirts becoming more full, and we're starting to see a nipped-in waistline for the first time in 30-40 years. I have so many fashion magazines and pattern catalogs from this period, but this is one of the few sewing patterns that I have from that era. This is Advance 4613, which was published in 1949, and it consists of a jacket, a sleeveless blouse, and a pleated skirt. Today we're just going to be making the jacket out of this rust red cotton corduroy. So if you've never seen a vintage sewing pattern before, this is what it looks like. These are the original instructions from 1949, and as you can see, just like a modern pattern, there are options for altering the length of the pattern pieces in case your proportions differ from the standard sewing pattern sizes. As always, I like to handle the original pattern as little as possible, so I'm going to be taking pictures of the instructions and any other important things on the pattern envelope for reference while I'm sewing. So here are the original tissue pattern pieces. Obviously, I'm trying to be as careful with them as possible since they are over 70 years old, and I'm going to trace them onto a roll of doctor's office paper so I don't have to pin into the original pattern. As you can see, there were some alterations done on this pattern. I believe this is the hem of the skirt panel. I did cut this like 2 months ago, so I don't quite remember. But obviously, the original dressmaker did make some changes to this pattern to make it fit her better. There are also tears in the original pattern that were taped up by the previous owner. I just think it's really cool to see things like this and little pinholes from the original maker. While I trace the pattern, I'd just like to take a minute to talk about the styling on this jacket. So it's pretty cropped. It kind of ends between the high hip and the hip, and that's pretty typical for the late 40s. Hemlines have risen a little bit since the middle of the decade, and that just makes the jackets more flattering because ending the hem around the hip line makes the hips look wider. It also has these angled pockets around the waist, like just below the waist. That was a really common technique used, especially in the early 50s, most of the time like big patch pockets to skirts to again make the hips look wider, waist look smaller, similarly to what's going on here. We're also seeing the very strong shoulder, kind of a remnant from the middle of the decade, and that's created through padding and kind of extending the shoulder and the armhole out further than we typically see on modern patterns. So these are the fabrics that I chose, the red cotton corduroys for the outside of the jacket, and I was planning on doing the facings in this plaid cotton. I used most of this fabric to make a 1950s skirt, coincidentally with the pattern that I bought at the same time as this pattern, but I did have a lot left over, so I decided to reuse it for this project. You can't really see the facings much on the final jacket, but I kind of just like knowing that they're there. I also used this polyester lining fabric to line the jacket. So here I'm laying my pattern pieces onto the fabric. If I remember correctly, I don't think I used the original cutting layouts that they had in the instructions because my fabric was a 60-inch width and the instructions had cutting layouts for 54-inch width, so I was able to fit them a bit more economically than in the pattern. I'm sure a lot of you guys know this, but this is kind of more of a historical thing, but fabrics used to be a lot narrower than they are today. Like now, for the most part, the smallest width you see is 45 inches. Historically, it could be like 20-something or 30-something depending on what fabric. So on especially Victorian or older gowns, you see lots of piecing within the pattern pieces to kind of accommodate for the narrow widths of fabric on those large voluminous skirts. Obviously, this pattern's from 1949, and so the suggested cutting layouts kind of reflect more of what modern fabrics would be. So they have cutting layouts for 54-inch width and 35-inch width, but even still in 1949, narrower fabrics were more common. One thing that I didn't really notice until I started making this pattern is that the collar isn't a Peter Pan collar that goes all the way around. It's kind of just like 2 tabs at the front. I don't love that, but when my hair is down, you can't really tell, so it doesn't really bother me. Here I'm cutting the facing pieces for the jacket, again out of that plaid quilting cotton, like I said. So next I transferred all of the marks from the original pattern to my fabric. That includes all of the notches and perforations. I couldn't use my usual disappearing ink fabric pen on this fabric because of the pile on the corduroy, so I instead used tailor's chalk, probably more historically accurate than my usual method. And how I did that is I just used pins to transfer where each perforation was, and then using the place where the pin was, I just rubbed a bit of tailor's chalk onto the fabric right over the pin. But of course, I feel like I do this way too often. I was supposed to mark the fabric on the wrong side so that it would be easier to fold and pin the darts, but I marked it on the right side, so that was a bit more difficult. And I connected all the lines using the tailor's chalk. So the first step, of course, was to pin and sew the darts. There are darts on both the front and back of the jacket. The pattern instructions wanted me to do bound buttonholes first, but I decided I wanted to add a metal zipper to this jacket instead of doing buttonholes. The whole time, I was so afraid that it was going to end up looking like a train conductor jacket or something like that, like a nutcracker or something, so I thought maybe adding the zipper might help with that. Thankfully, I don't think it ended up looking like a nutcracker or a train conductor. I actually really love this jacket. I think it's really versatile, and it kind of works for the 1940s and for like later periods, like maybe the 1970s. Because this fabric was so thick, I decided to cut open my dart so that it would lay a bit more flat. I didn't really iron anything when making this jacket because I didn't want to flatten the pile on the corduroy. I know what you're supposed to do is like buy one of those needle boards or put another piece of fabric underneath so that the pile doesn't get crushed, but I was kind of afraid to do that. So instead I was just really careful to finger press everything that I felt needed to be flat, and on the whole it came out pretty good. Next was just stitching all of the main seams on the jacket, so the center back seam, the 2 shoulder seams, and the 2 side seams, and I just pinned them and sewed them together. So next I worked on the welt pockets on the front of the jacket, and I decided to use the lining fabric for those for just a bit of color, and the construction on these is actually pretty interesting. So first I sewed one side of the pocket to the place on the jacket where it was supposed to be, then I cut the welt right above it, and I kind of stitched around that to baste the seam allowances down. Then I was able to turn the pocket to the inside of the jacket, do a bit of top stitching to keep that secure, and then I made the pocket flap, which the lining of that was the lining fabric, and the outside was the outer corduroy, obviously clipping my curves, turning it inside out, etc. Then I could stitch that to the other side of the opening, and then the other end of the pocket bag was stitched to the top of that to close up the pocket from the inside. I hope that makes sense. This was probably like a translational error, but the width of the pocket opening on the jacket was a little bit too wide, and so I did have to recut the pocket flaps to be wider to try and cover a bit more of that area, and the pocket bag was nearly too small to fit into the slit in the jacket. So next, in order to accommodate for the zipper instead of the buttonholes, I trimmed a bit of the seam allowance off the center front. Next I did the front facings and everything associated with that, so the zipper, the collar, and the facings. So to prepare everything for that, first I created the collar tabs. As I said before, it's not actually a real Peter Pan collar, it's just kind of tabs on the front of the jacket. So there were just these 2 shapes that I pinned and stitched together and then clipped the curve so that I could turn them inside out. Next, I pinned and basted that to the neckline, and it'll be properly secured down once I sew the facing. Next, I had to baste the zipper into place. The black zipper really isn't ideal, so I tried to get as close to the zipper teeth as possible when sewing it on so that the black wouldn't really show. This was just what I had on hand in my collection. It was also a tiny bit short, so it doesn't extend all the way down or up the jacket, but I think it's like acceptable. Next, I sewed the back facing to the front facing in preparation for sewing both to the jacket. If you're unfamiliar with sewing, this is basically just a tracing of the front few inches of the jacket so that when we sew that onto the jacket, we can turn it to the inside of the jacket and finish the front edge. I had to stitch this on with a zipper foot because the zipper teeth were in the way. That was a bit annoying. The pattern wanted me to interface the front edge as well, but I was afraid that it would make the jacket look a bit too formal, so I didn't end up doing that. And in preparation for turning this to the inside of the jacket, I just clipped the corners and the curves so that it would all lay smoothly. Then, after turning it to the inside, in order to keep it laying flat, I top stitched along the zipper. So one of the last things to do was the sleeve. This isn't my preferred method of construction, like doing the sleeves last, because I feel like everything just looks really bad when it's sleeveless and meant to have sleeves. So I find that it's better for like morale and also fitting for me to do the sleeves when it's in a less constructed form. But this works too. So the sleeves have a bit of detail on the bottom of them. So first there's a dart that runs from about like mid forearm to the cuff, and so I sewed that into place. And of course I also sewed the sleeve seam all the way up the arm. The other thing the sleeve has going on is it's got kind of cuffs along the bottom, so I also sewed those into tubes. Then, to put it all together, I sewed the cuffs onto the bottom of the sleeve along the lower edge so that I could then turn them to the inside of the jacket and the edge would be finished. I cut a slit in the seam allowance so that I could turn it smoothly at the point there, and I also cut off a bit of excess fabric. For some reason, the jacket sleeve was a little bit longer than the cuff. So after setting the first sleeve into the jacket, I really didn't like how it was kind of off the shoulder in that 1940s way, but also puffy. I find that that's a common issue on a lot of 1940s patterns, that 1940s sleeves are supposed to kind of just drop straight off the shoulder, but instead they put a bit too much fullness there and they're like kind of puffy. Like, I think you're supposed to use the steam from the iron to shrink out the extra fullness there, but it's always like way too much fabric to shrink out using an iron. So when I went to set the next sleeve, I just trimmed off a bit off the armscye. It was also really off the shoulder, so I also trimmed off a bit of the side of the jacket as well at the armscye. And of course, I also made those changes to the first sleeve I set. So next I made the lining for the jacket basically in the same way that I made the jacket itself, and to insert that into the jacket, I just turned it so that the raw edges were facing outwards, and then kind of pinned it into the jacket using key points like the underarm seam or the top of the sleeve cap to match up from the lining onto the jacket. I cut off all the excess around the edge of the jacket, and then I could fold back the lining and cross stitch it into place. I'm gonna be honest, the cross stitch isn't the most practical because I feel like, especially when you do it on the larger side like I did here, it's very easy to pull when you're taking on and off the jacket, and honestly, really small felling stitches are a lot better, but I just think it's so pretty that I have to use it every chance I have. Of course, I also did the same thing to the cuffs of the jacket to secure the lining in place. And with that, the jacket was finished. As I said, it kind of works for 1970s and 1940s, so here I've got it styled two different ways. On the whole, I'm really happy with how this came out. There aren't really a lot of glaring sewing errors. Probably the only thing would be the pockets, as I explained before. The cuffs ended up looking pretty clean, and I wish you could see the facing on the front of the jacket a bit more, but it's not a huge deal. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.